One former UK national security advisor called it the most serious foreign policy crisis since the end of the Cold War. Debate in the Commons has been prompted by MPs worried that Europe may be weeks away from a major war in Ukraine. And US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said that a Russian invasion of Ukraine could come in early 2022. Sounds pretty alarming. How did we get here? And what are the chances that it does turn really ugly? Well, let's have a look. At one level, this all started with troops massing on the border. We saw it previously earlier this year, and now the troops have returned, massing on Ukraine's eastern and northern borders. The NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said that it wasn't clear what the intent was, but we see heavy armour, drones, electronic warfare systems, and tens of thousands of combat-ready troops. American intelligence estimated around 175,000 troops being mobilised and able to be in position early next year. Those troops include elite forces alongside the more ordinary troops. At the same time, Russia's navy is preparing to blockade Ukraine's south coast, or maybe even launch amphibious attacks against it. Observers have said that they're also seeing logistics and medical equipment being moved around, which you could take as an indicator that large-scale military action is at least being seriously considered. From here, Russian President Putin could decide on a full-scale invasion, a more limited operation to take more of eastern Ukraine, or simply establish a land bridge to Crimea, or he could decide to walk away. The West clearly is keen that it should be that one. US President Biden and Putin had a 2-hour virtual summit to talk through the situation. According to the White House, Biden told Putin the US and our allies would respond with strong economic and other measures if Russia invades Ukraine. According to the Kremlin, Putin blamed Ukraine for the crisis and demanded guarantees that the Western military alliance NATO would not admit Ukraine into membership. The White House was keen to give the impression that it was really going to take action if it happened. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan demonstrated this flair for the dramatic when he told reporters, "I will look you in the eye and tell you, as President Biden looked Putin in the eye and told him today, that things we did not do in 2014, we are prepared to do now." Ooh, sounds scary. But one thing that definitely is not amongst the things we did not do is sending US combat troops to fight in Ukraine. Biden said that's not on the table. We have a moral obligation and a legal obligation to our NATO allies if they were to attack under Article 5. I think he meant if they were under attack, not to attack. It's a sacred obligation. That obligation does not extend to Ukraine. He didn't rule it out totally, depending on what other NATO countries do, but the US certainly wouldn't do it unilaterally. But severe consequences. So what does that mean exactly? They said it would include financial sanctions applied with coordination of European allies, additional defensive material, which I think is a euphemism for weapons, to be provided to Ukraine, and fortify our NATO allies on the eastern flank with additional capabilities. Some of the sanctions would cause some real pain to Russia. So, for example, it's been floated that they could bar Russia from the SWIFT international financial network. And also, of course, finally cancelling the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which Russia has been pushing to be opened with the leverage of the current energy crisis. All of that's well and good, but you can't know whether it will be enough or even if it's appropriate in the first place, unless you have some idea of why Putin is doing what he's doing. The hardest thing in the world sometimes is to understand what other countries are doing because it involves being able to empathise with how the world looks to them, which is shaped by their experience of history. Generally, we can't get out of our own heads long enough to do that, especially if we start off feeling judgmental about the other side. If we assume that everyone is the hero of their own movie, and in Putin's mind he is the good guy, how does that look? Firstly, you have to consider that in Putin's mind, Ukraine isn't just some neighbouring country, it's a core part of Russian history and identity. Arguably, Russian statehood emerged from the medieval Kievan Rus civilization, if you want to trace it back. During the Soviet Union, Ukraine was the economic powerhouse that provided many of its most important products and processes. Many Russian language writers come from Ukraine, and so on and so on. For someone of Putin's generation, Ukraine was a key part of his country. So when the Soviet Union broke up on December the 8th, 1991, and Russia, Ukraine and Belarus set up the Commonwealth of Independent States, that was a pretty traumatic time. For Brits, you could equate it to if Scotland declares independence from the United Kingdom, I imagine. Putin himself wrote about it. Modern Ukraine is entirely the product of the Soviet era. We know and remember well that it was shaped for a significant part on the lands of historical Russia. Together we have always been and will be many times stronger and more successful, for we are one people. Indeed, he once famously said to President George W. Bush, "George, you have to understand that Ukraine is not even a country. Part of its territory is in Eastern Europe, and the greater part was given to us." So that was one thing. And once Putin took office, he tried to bind Ukraine to Russia in any way that he could, to try to emphasize the cultural oneness. But that attempt failed. In 2013-2014, the Revolution of Dignity saw protests against the pro-Russia government and its eventual overthrow, sparked by its refusal to sign the political association and free trade agreement with the European Union. The interim new government signed that agreement and purged many of the existing civil servants. Americans welcomed the move, calling it a just cause for a country choosing its own destiny. But Putin and the Russians were completely convinced that this was a coup, organised by the CIA, designed to pull Ukraine away from Russia. As a result, Russia sent troops into Crimea, which had vacillated for years between Ukraine and Russia in its political affiliations, and it began fomenting a separatist war in eastern Ukraine. We should pay attention to this because it showed President Putin's willingness to escalate the conflict in defence of Russia's bond with Ukraine. And this all now has come to a head because the current president of Ukraine, Zelensky, who Putin had high hopes for, really started taking a more aggressively pro-Western and anti-Russian tack. That included conducting military exercises with Western forces. If you consider that throughout the time of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was a physical buffer zone between Russia and the West, you should be able to see why they would feel directly threatened by that. And you can understand, therefore, the horror that Putin would feel hearing Ukraine talking up the prospect of it joining NATO, which is what he most fears. It's not as though he's wrong to think that Ukraine is heading in that direction. In 2014, only 12% of Ukrainians polled as wanting to join NATO, but in recent polls that has grown to more than half. Putin doesn't believe that by evidence of his own writing on the topic. He feels that the West is pulling Ukraine away against the will of the Ukraine people. The polling doesn't support it, but he'd hardly be the first leader not to believe the polls when they don't tell him what he wants to hear. But of course, that means, in his mind, it is likely that a Russian invasion might be met with a welcome from Ukrainians on the ground, as if they would be greeted as liberators. So if you're wondering why Russia is taking this action now, part of the answer to that is simply that Putin feels as though he is running out of time. Olga Oliker, the Programme Director for Europe and Central Asia with the International Crisis Group, described it like this. The reason there's a war in Ukraine has a lot to do with Russia's perception of the post-Cold War order in Europe. This notion that Western states have been moving closer and closer to Russia's borders, and indeed gobbling up its natural sphere of influence. Ukraine's on the front line of that. The writer Peter Hitchens invited Americans to consider how they would have felt if it had been they that lost the Cold War, and as a result Texas had declared independence and applied to join the Warsaw Pact, with Soviet bases being built on their state. And he made also this observation. Russia had, by and large, been liberated from Soviet rule by Democrats or would-be Democrats. But in the non-Russian parts of the USSR, liberation tended to be accomplished by nationalists. Russia, belatedly waking up to the danger of having nationalist bombs planted under its former empire, has now turned nationalist itself, and that is very much not approved of. Unfortunately, Russia has been in a losing game. Its annexation of Crimea was the prompt for Ukraine to look more intensively away from it towards the West. There was a peace process in 2014-2015 known as the Minsk Agreement, but it was never fully implemented, a fact which both sides naturally blamed on each other, and that's led to this simmering conflict resulting in the death of 14,000 people. And the dynamic set in motion by all of that has brought us to where we are right now. Ironically, Ukraine's hopes of joining NATO aren't seen as a realistic probability in the short term. But when Putin demanded that assurance of Biden in the recent summit, that is something that he simply wasn't going to promise. The position's always been that countries are free to decide for themselves what treaties they enter into. And Biden is not going to give an assurance that that's not going to happen, even though right now he really doesn't want the US to be put in the position of being obligated by treaty to fight a war to defend Ukraine from Russia. From where Putin sits, of course, the refusal to give that assurance is likely seen as a confirmation that that's the plan. And it's all being driven by America in the first place, which is why Putin, prompted by this conflict, has been very keen to talk to Biden, but not to Ukrainian President Zelensky. He's reportedly convinced that it's America's show. They can simply eventually be pushed into ruling out Ukraine membership of NATO. So that's the background to how Putin sees the world. Unfortunately, knowing all that doesn't tell us anything about what he's up to right now with this action and what his intentions are. Is he provoking America? Is he testing the West's response? Is he about to invade? Is he trying to bring Ukrainians into line as they realise they're completely outgunned? By all of reports, Western intelligence has no idea. And that's almost certainly exactly how the Kremlin wants it. They go to great lengths to hide their intentions to keep their rivals guessing and off balance. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges of the Centre for European Policy Analysis said that the long-term strategy, though, is clear. Their number one objective is to re-establish as much of the old empire as it could. Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia. I think this is part of the legacy that President Putin sees for himself. At a time when various superpowers have started a race amongst themselves fighting for influence, this doesn't seem that unusual. We've seen China seeking to influence via its Belt and Road Initiative, and then we've seen both America and Europe responding to that by looking at how they can reinforce their own spheres of influence. Against that backdrop, Russia just wants to re-establish as much of its old sphere of influence as it can, recognising that a lot of it is out of reach for the time being. Ukraine is not wavering to date. Indeed, it not only wants to join NATO, but it also wants to become a member of the European Union. The Ukrainian Prime Minister, Denis Shmyhal, said that Ukraine was committed to fighting climate change in line with the EU's Green Deal plan, as well as cooperate on energy, digital regulation, cybersecurity as part of its attempt to converge with EU standards. It also said that Ukraine could provide storage for an EU strategic natural gas reserve, although that's not an offer likely to appeal until it's clear there's not going to be an invasion anytime soon. Such an outcome would be many years away. It's not even an official candidate country for EU membership, but that's the longer-term goal. So, where does all this leave us? What are the chances this turns into the biggest armed conflict in Europe for many decades? The things making it more likely. The deployments seem to include all the different elements you'd need to actually carry out the operation for real and to mobilise quickly and in force. Secondly, Russia is feeling under time pressure because the longer it leaves it, the further away Ukraine drifts. And it may feel there are constraints on the strength of response that they will get from the West. When it comes to Europe, even without Nord Stream 2, Europe is clearly shown by the current energy crisis to be dependent on Russia for gas, and that may well constrain it from joining an armed conflict against it. Russia has a lot of leverage. And of course, it's also distracted with its internal crises, tensions with Belarus, internal fighting with Poland and Hungary, French elections coming up, an inexperienced German chancellor, and of course, a massive hangover from Brexit. And when Nord Stream 2 does come online, if it does, that will allow Russia to bypass Ukraine in supplying that gas, which will put more pressure on it as it loses an important income stream. And as for America, he's highly likely generally to be of the view that it is at a particular weak point right now. The humiliating retreat from Afghanistan will have fueled that belief, along with the divisions and the problems the Biden administration is facing at home. Biden's early declaration that it won't send troops to fight in Ukraine will have added to that impression. So will the fact that lawmakers in the US Congress declined to give Biden additional resources in the recent defense bill to push back on Putin, save for a modest boost to assistance for Ukraine. But Putin won't assume that America will stay weak forever or for an extended period, so that's an argument for being opportunistic while the chance is there. And Putin has pressures of his own at home. COVID-19 has been hitting Russia hard in recent months, and the economy is struggling. If he believes an invasion of Ukraine would be as popular domestically as was his annexation of Crimea, he might well see it as just the thing he needs. But there are some strong arguments against the idea that an invasion is soon to follow. For one thing, some argue that if Russia was intent on a massive offensive against Ukraine, it would employ more discretion to catch them by surprise, as they did with Crimea. Secondly, Putin is a careful strategist, and this would be a huge escalation in willingness to enter a direct military confrontation, and it's just not been his style to date. The Ukrainian army is stronger than it was in 2014 and better armed because it's been one of the leading recipients of US military aid in the world in recent years. Still outmatched for sure, but motivated to make an invasion more costly for Russia, which would increase the likelihood that it would become an unpopular war at home. And occupations are hard. The Crimea was a part of Ukraine where a majority of citizens were ethnic Russians, and there'd been a history of tacking towards Russia and away from Ukraine. In this case, Russia would be on more hostile territory. Arguably better that Putin feels he's used this as another opportunity to be clear about Russia's red lines so that no others should think that they can be crossed in the future without consequence. Ultimately, his endgame may be to use this situation to threaten the West as a whole, looking to force concessions from NATO on its eastern expansion and to create a new division of Eastern Europe. While the great powers are carving up their new areas of influence worldwide, Russia wants to re-establish some of its old areas of influence. It believes that the position taken by Barack Obama in 2016 has not substantially changed. Obama told The Atlantic that the US didn't respond more aggressively to the annexation of Crimea because of a simple, brutal logic. Ukraine was more important to Russia than it was to the United States. Washington had no treaty obligation towards Kyiv, and that Ukraine was Russia's neighbour but far from the United States. Ultimately, that's why there will not be military engagement from the West. And it's why, regardless of the fine words the US gives to President Zelensky about the US's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity in the face of Russian aggression, it has pre-announced that such support comes via sanctions. Not the usual kinds of sanctions, but as far as we can possibly go with sanctions, denying the entire international banking system to the Russians, and things like that are going to be very devastating to the Russians. Maybe Russia has shrugged off sanctions in recent years, and given the huge element of national identity and strategic importance that comes with this, doesn't seem likely to dissuade them on its own. All this said, the incentives for Russia to go to war on this are, on balance, not high. His goal is to get Ukraine to come back under the Russian umbrella. A large-scale invasion might well be the final death of that prospect, more than it is likely to achieve it. The action on Crimea turned the public in Ukraine away from Russia towards Europe. Even the threat of an assault is likely to be making that stronger, not weaker. When he came to power 21 years ago, Putin said he would restore Russia to its rightful place as a great power. time is passing. His opportunity for that legacy is receding with it. But for all that he has shown huge cunning in his ability to disrupt the West and to conduct a sort of guerrilla soft conflict against countries that he feels humiliated a great nation in the past, the conduct of Putin's Russia has naturally pushed his would-be allies away, while the conduct of Europe and NATO and the West has, for the time being at least, attracted them towards it. His inability to find a way to reverse the polarity on that magnet is unlikely to be changed by the threat to go to war. He may justifiably see the West as being weak in many ways, but in the competition to exercise that sort of soft power, it's the one where he is really outgunned and outclassed. Which doesn't mean we don't have some serious problems of decline in the West. Oh yes, we do. I made a video looking at why we're facing decline, and it goes deep. You might be interested to watch that one next.